feminists have long grappled with how to position Elizabeth I within the broader narrative of women's history. Her 45-year reign as monarch of England stands as one of the few examples of absolute female rule in Western history, a period marked by relative prosperity, cultural flourishing, and political resilience. And yet, Elizabeth herself would almost certainly have rejected the label feminist. Chloe Hallian, writing for the Women's Media Center, captures this tension well. She describes Elizabeth as a beguiling Machiavellian woman who, against all odds, led her country to a golden age while battling against the acute disadvantage of being a woman. In a time when gender inequality was widely accepted, Elizabeth I was able to control her subjects despite being a woman. However, Elizabeth I would not consider herself a feminist. To assert her power and political dominance, Elizabeth was forced to create two personas, one of masculine leadership that suppressed other women, and one of feminine grace and allure. While Elizabeth stood as a powerful example of what women could achieve, she did so under the guise of a king rather than a queen. She deliberately embraced masculine symbols of authority and allowed no other women to rise beside her. She did not uplift her fellow women. Rather, she competed with them, ensuring none could rival her shine. And though she occasionally faltered, most often in the company of men she admired, she never allowed personal desire to eclipse her political judgment. As ruler, she always put her country first. Yet, even this, some argue, reveals a selfish edge. Elizabeth believed that marriage would reduce her to a secondary role, subservient to a husband. Powerless as a girl in the courts of her father Henry VIII and her half-sister Mary, she forged a path that ensured her future would never again be in another's hand. From this perspective, the beloved good Queen Bess appears less a benevolent ruler than a calculating sovereign, driven as much by the preservation of her personal authority as by the well-being of her people. Still, as Hallian notes, Elizabeth was living proof of the potential power of independent women. At a time when most female monarchs in Europe held only ceremonial or marginal roles, Elizabeth assumed full authority. She fulfilled all the obligations expected of a king, leading armies, navigating diplomacy, and consolidating domestic power, while rejecting the traditional feminine duties of marriage and childbearing in order to protect her crown. When Elizabeth died in 1603, 45 years after ascending the throne, she left unresolved the question that had shadowed her reign: who would succeed her? Many had grown tired of waiting for an answer. The so-called Golden Age of England had been built upon the blood of Catholic martyrs, betrayed confidants, and foreign rivals, all swept aside as Elizabeth solidified her rule. At the heart of it all stood a solitary monarch who once famously declared, "I do not choose that my grave should be dug while I am still alive." You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series is about Elizabeth I, episode number 8, England's Greatest King. Hollywood often frames Mary, Queen of Scots as Elizabeth's first chief antagonist, and with good reason. From the very beginning of her reign, Elizabeth was torn over how best to handle her cousin. As a legitimate heir to the royal line of succession, Mary represented a standing threat, a figure around whom England's many malcontents could rally. Elizabeth knew this all too well. She had nearly lost her own life during 2 uprisings against her sister, Queen Mary I, in which rebels sought to place Elizabeth on the throne. Her cousin's fall from power in Scotland began with scandal. After her alleged involvement in the shocking murder of her husband, she was deposed, and her infant son, James VI, was proclaimed king in her place. Fleeing to England in desperation, Mary never saw her son again. For the next 19 years, she would live under Elizabeth's watchful eye as a prisoner. Mary gave her cousin countless reasons to act against her, but Elizabeth hesitated. She feared that executing a fellow monarch would set a dangerous precedent. The divine right of kings, once sacred and unchallenged, had been shaken by the Protestant Reformation. In this new world, rebels could claim divine favor as justification for deposing their rulers. To undermine Mary was, Elizabeth believed, to undermine herself. So, she endured Mary's insults, her endless petitions for better accommodations, and her tireless scheming. But by 1585, the threat Mary posed could no longer be ignored. She was placed in the custody of a zealous Puritan who saw treachery everywhere. He tried to sever her from the outside world, subjecting her servants to humiliating strip searches each time they entered or left the house. But he soon realized that, rather than extinguishing her plots, it would be more useful to manage them. Enter Gilbert Giffard, a double agent working for Elizabeth's intelligence network. Once facing execution for operating illegally as a Catholic deacon, Giffard now offered a valuable advantage. He had the credentials to access the French embassy, which had long served as a conduit between Mary and her foreign allies. Historian Anne Somerset notes that for years, no unauthorized letters had reached Mary, thanks to the security net around her. Giffard proposed a method to bypass it. In January 1586, Mary received a letter, her first unsanctioned correspondence in over a year. Thrilled, she replied immediately, encouraging full trust in the courier. From that point on, all of her secret communications passed through Giffard. What she didn't know was that every letter she was sent was intercepted, opened by Elizabeth's Privy Council, and resealed before delivery. 7 months into the operation, Mary incriminated herself beyond redemption in what became known as the Babington Plot. 6 Catholic Englishmen conspired to assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, and incite a nationwide uprising of English Catholics, timed with an invasion by Spanish forces. Rather than shut the plot down immediately, Elizabeth's advisors allowed it to unfold, seeking to expose its full scope. To that end, one of her counselors forged a postscript onto one of Mary's letters, asking for the names of the 6 would-be assassins. Until then, the conspirators had communicated only in code. Alarmed, the traitors refused to respond directly, but it was too late. Within days, key figures were arrested. Lacking the names of all involved, the authorities moved clumsily, tipping off the rest. The lead assassin, John Savage, was ordered to carry out the strike while he was still able to, but he claimed he couldn't gain access to the palace because his clothes were too shabby. That delay proved fatal. One conspirator quickly broke under torture in the Tower of London. The ringleader had already made the Crown's task easy. He'd arrange a portrait of the group. Their plan was exposed, their identities handed over with artistic flourish. Though this wasn't the first Catholic plot against Elizabeth, Mary's direct involvement pierced deeply. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth had stayed the hand of justice, unwilling to execute her cousin. Parliament, enraged, had even proposed legislation demanding that any attempt on the Queen's life be punished with a death that was both hideous and lingering. Elizabeth had rejected that proposal. Now, she did not stand in the way. When the conspirators were executed on September 20th, 1586, their deaths were meant to be a spectacle. Somerset writes, "The hangman saw to it that their sufferings were frightening. The wretched men hanged never a whit before they were taken down and had their privates cut off and bowels taken out alive." But the plan backfired. The crowd, far from cheering, recoiled in horror. Mary's chambers were searched and 3 bags of correspondence were seized. The evidence was undeniable. Reluctantly, Elizabeth allowed a trial. 25 of the 26 judges found Mary guilty of treason. Parliament urged execution, branding her the daughter of sedition, the nurse of impiety, the handmaid of wickedness. Still, Elizabeth wavered. She encouraged Mary to write her a personal letter, just as Elizabeth herself had done when imprisoned under her sister's rule. But Mary wasn't interested in forgiveness. She warned that Elizabeth would one day have to answer for the lives lost at her command. It was enough for Queen Elizabeth I to finally decide that it was time for her presumptive heir to die. Mary's son, James, made a theatrical effort to save her, but it was pure politics. Elizabeth promised him in a sealed letter that so long as he didn't provoke her, she wouldn't obstruct his path to the English throne. He accepted the deal. After all, he had no relationship with the mother he'd never known. Like Elizabeth, he now only cared for power. France intervened, urging Elizabeth to name James her successor in exchange for allowing Mary to live in peaceful exile. The Queen replied that such a proposal would be to cut her own throat. Her council, eager to finalize matters, fed her a stream of alarming rumors. Mary had escaped. Arsonists were ready to torch London. Spanish troops had already landed. The pressure mounted. For months after the guilty verdict, Elizabeth finally signed the execution order. Then, hesitating again, she told the courier to delay delivery, hoping Mary's handlers might simply quietly murder her instead. As Somerset explains, if Mary were quietly eliminated, it could be given out that she had died of natural causes. If, on the other hand, she was executed, Elizabeth would have to justify an act she regarded as theoretically indefensible. Elizabeth knew the deed was necessary. but her conscience refused to be soothed by legal justifications alone. On February 8th, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded. Her final words were, "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Legend holds that her lips continued to move in prayer for 15 minutes after the axe fell. English Catholics wasted no time in venerating Mary as a martyr, executed not just for treason, but by trying to return England to the Catholic fold. Ironically, the woman responsible for her death governed with a curious duality. Queen Elizabeth made Protestantism the state religion, but her enforcement style leaned more toward plausible deniability. As long as Catholics practiced discreetly and swore allegiance, she looked the other way. But the 1559 Act of Supremacy drew a hard line. Preaching or promoting another faith publicly could cost you your life. This wasn't a law targeting Catholics alone. Puritans and Presbyterians also found themselves snared in the Queen's religious dragnet. In 1584, all clergy were forced to affirm that the Church of England's Book of Common Prayer contained nothing contrary to Scripture. Between 300 and 400 refused. They were purged. Now, the problem with firing hundreds of preachers all at once is someone still has to deliver Sunday's sermon. The church, suddenly understaffed, filled the vacancies with men unfit for the pulpit. Drunkeners, gamblers, whoremongers, England's spiritual shepherds began to resemble its sheep. Local congregations noticed. So did the Puritans. Watching their parishes devolve into chaos, they decided the system was beyond redemption. Reform would no longer be sought in Parliament. It would be written in ink and, if necessary, blood. The Puritans believed that the majority of Protestants remained in bondage to form and rituals that had begun during the reign of the Catholic Church. They wanted to rid England of anything that smacked of Roman Catholic idolatry, including kneeling for communion, priests' vestments, as well as profane and immoral plays. Their underground network attempted to initiate change first through Earth's mightiest weapon, the pen. The author of the particularly sharp denunciation of the Church of England's finest pastors was quickly identified, however. Cracking under torture, the Puritan ring was dismantled, leaving the remaining Puritans depressed to know that the Church of England wouldn't be further reformed in their lifetime. The Queen bore full responsibility for the crisis, although many of her closest advisors shared Puritan sympathies. Elizabeth wouldn't bend. In her eyes, Puritanism posed just as much danger as Catholicism. Viewing the problem through such a lens meant that she had reason to worry. Catholics had already backed 3 major plots against her. By equating Puritans, essentially radical Protestants, with traitors, she signaled that theological deviation was indistinguishable from political rebellion. What truly unnerved Elizabeth wasn't doctrine, it was defiance. The Puritans believed no one, not even the Queen, was above reproach. The Dean of York expressed the establishment's fear succinctly. Just as the Pope's divine right had been stripped and handed to the monarch, these reformers now meant to strip that right from the monarch, taking God's blessings for themselves. The Puritans wouldn't sail for the New World until 1630. Like their Catholic counterparts, they simply grew quieter over the course of Elizabeth's reign. The government, meanwhile, believed Catholicism was circling the drain. By the 1570s, officials were bold enough to predict its extinction. Then came a twist. A Catholic seminary opened across the Channel in France, training English priests in the hope of a possible Catholic restoration. Their mission quickly evolved from waiting in the wings to initiating the invasion. Within 6 years, 500 priests had re-entered England, often under the cover of night. 2 years after that, Elizabeth's government began executing any and all of them she could find, embracing martyrdom at the hands of a woman who had been twice excommunicated. The Jesuits hastened their trafficking of Catholic priests in order to begin what they hoped was a counter-reformation. Somerset tells us that the English government first became aware that the Jesuits had entered the competition for the nation's soul when a manifesto written by Campion came into circulation. The piece, which became known in Protestant circles as Campion's Brag, contained the following challenge: "Be it known unto you that we have made a league, all the Jesuits in the world, cheerfully to carry the cross you shall lay upon us, and never to despair of your recovery, while we have a man left to be racked with your torments, or consumed with your prisons. The expense is reckoned, the enterprise is begun. It is of God, it cannot be withstood." The Queen proceeded to crack down even harder on the nation's remaining Catholics, fining them harshly if they were convicted of attending a private Jesuit mass. Furthermore, failure to attend a Protestant Anglican church service resulted in a £20 a month fine, something that even the wealthiest of her subjects would find it hard to support. Despite her anger, however, she continued to turn a blind eye to the friends in her court that harbored Catholic sympathies. These harsher laws were all framed so that the punishments were in line with the acts of treason against the court. Somerset tells us that by bringing the priests' proselytizing activities within line 2, the treason laws, the government aimed to avoid the stigma of persecuting in the name of religion. It was laid down that priests would be guilty of treason only if they converted anyone with the deliberate intent of withdrawing them from their allegiance. But in the practice, the wording of the statute afforded the priests no protection, for when cases came to court, it was taken that all conversions automatically entailed a withdrawal of allegiance and hence were treason. Understandably, the priests denounced it was monstrous that they should be deemed to have committed a political offense, when in fact their only interest was in the cure of souls. Such arguments rested on the false premise that religion and secular affairs could in some way be segregated, when the reality was that at the time they were indistinguishably linked. As one Protestant propagandist put it, religion and politics in England are, through God's singular blessing, preserved in life as with one spirit. He that doth take away the life of the one doth procure the death of the other. Campion, the Jesuit leader who had thrown down the gauntlet, was subsequently arrested and racked multiple times. Despite having spikes driven into his fingers, he remained unwilling to make any statement which could be damaging to the ongoing Catholic cause. Although they had enough evidence to execute him beneath the new laws equating religion to treason, the Queen's counselors instead manufactured some false charges that he had conspired to murder Elizabeth. Her popularity remained high enough with her crypto-Catholic subjects that tacking on such charges ensured that they wouldn't rise in rebellion upon the execution of the Jesuit priest. Indeed, Campion's hanging was merely the start of a wave of high-profile executions which failed to stem the spread of Catholicism. In total, Elizabeth's regime executed 123 priests and another 60 Catholic lay people. 3 out of every 4 captured priests were imprisoned rather than killed. The severity of punishment doled out often mirrored the level of threat that Elizabeth was under. In 1588, for instance, the year of the Spanish Armada, 21 priests and 16 Catholic laymen were put to death. Whether or not a priest was executed often depended on how he responded to a handful of carefully chosen interrogations during his trial or after conviction. One of the most consequential was whether he would take up arms for the Queen if England were invaded. Among Catholics, this had become infamous as the bloody question, because a wrong answer meant certain death. Yet, even some who pledged to defend Elizabeth weren't spared the gallows. The Catholic Counter-Reformation ultimately failed for a number of reasons. First and foremost was the fact that Catholic priests were wholly dependent on the wealthy nobility of England. Aristocrats allowed the clergy to celebrate Mass within their private homes, but refused to invite others for fear of getting caught. While a quarter of England's elites remained Catholic, only about 1.5% of the general population still held to the old faith. The Jesuits managed to preserve Catholicism, but their influence never reached England's lower class. The movement also lost its most potent symbol with the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Without a viable Catholic successor to rally around, rebellion against Elizabeth became a moot point. Finally, King Philip of Spain's repeated attempts to invade England all ended in failure. The sinking of the Spanish Armada, which we covered in our previous episode, didn't bring an end to the war between England and Spain. One of the driving forces behind King Philip's obsession with toppling Elizabeth, his former sister-in-law, was the plight of the English Catholics. While Elizabeth refused to cast herself as the protector of global Protestantism, Philip fully embraced the role of Catholicism's champion. He immediately began efforts to rebuild his shattered fleet. Eager to press her advantage, Elizabeth assumed his regrouping would take place in Lisbon and launched a sizable land invasion of Portugal. From the outset, however, the expedition was plagued by delays due to unfavorable winds, and the mission quickly spiraled over budget, exceeding its original allocation by more than 150%. Money played a central role throughout the war. Elizabeth was constantly constrained by financial limitations. Her annual tax base was just £250,000, nowhere near enough to support multiple foreign campaigns. The defense against the Armada alone had cost her £161,000, consuming more than half of her yearly revenue. At the same time, she was entangled in the Netherlands, had committed to war in Portugal, and would soon be pulled into conflicts in both France and Ireland. Professors Emily Goldman and Leo Blanken highlight the role of economics in warfare, noting that the fundamental premises of national security studies is the privileged position of the state as the key purveyor of violence. Commonly, the very form of the nation-state is justified as the unit of political organization that achieves the most efficient economy of scale for generating violence. You don't have to look any further than the Cold War to see how a nation's economy can make or break its ability to wage prolonged conflict. With the Spanish reeling, Elizabeth took drastic steps to capitalize on her victory over the Armada. In 1590 alone, she sold off more than £125,000 worth of crown lands. She also imposed forced loans on her wealthiest subjects in 1588, 1590, 1591, and again in 1596. Several raids were launched against lucrative Spanish shipping routes from the New World, but piracy and corruption plagued the effort. Even when English ships successfully captured Spanish cargo, much of the profit mysteriously vanished before the ships ever made it back to port. The newly promoted Earl of Essex, Robert de Vereux, was put in charge of an expedition to Portugal. At just 22 years old, Essex had quickly become Elizabeth's newest favorite, following the death of his stepfather, Robert Dudley, the longtime Earl of Leicester. Dudley had spent decades in the Queen's inner circle, forever lingering in her friend zone despite their deep personal bond. Although not related by blood, Essex inherited many of the same traits that had endeared Dudley to Elizabeth: charm, ambition, and a flair for court politics. He also followed his stepfather's exact playbook in gaining the Queen's affection. Despite the 30-year age gap, Elizabeth openly flirted with him and rewarded his loyalty with lucrative privileges, most notably a monopoly on sweet wine that made him one of the richest men at court. Essex's meteoric rise to court earned him a devoted following, so enthusiastic it threatened to drown him in flattery. But it also bred resentment amongst those who feared for their own influence and status. He developed a reputation for volatility, frequently quarreling with the Queen and storming away from the court until she missed her newest plaything and summoned him back. His leadership during the Portugal campaign was riddled with mistakes. Nearly half of his troops died from disease during the grueling 45-mile march to Lisbon. Worse still, he failed to coordinate effectively with Sir Francis Drake, who was supposed to deliver the artillery needed for a siege. Instead, Drake veered off course, using his fleet to raid Spanish ports along the northern coast. Lacking both the manpower and firepower to take the city, Essex resorted to a theatrical gesture. He rode up to Lisbon's gates and challenged the city's champion to a single combat to decide its fate. No one responded. Defeated and empty-handed, Essex and the surviving English troops returned home, leaving behind nothing but the memory of a costly and ill-fated expedition. Elizabeth was reluctantly drawn deeper into the conflict in France when Protestant King Henry IV came under threat from a powerful faction known as the Catholic League. Though she would have preferred to stay out of continental wars, the Queen saw no choice. If the League, backed by Spain, overran France, Elizabeth feared the country would become a gateway for Spanish domination across Europe and eventually the world. Despite her misgivings, she committed over 7,000 English troops to support Henry, even though he had previously defaulted on debts to her and failed to fulfill his promises to match her military contributions. Her frustration only deepened when he betrayed her trust a third time. In a bizarre attempt to smooth things over, Henry sent Elizabeth a baby elephant. She was unmoved. Her official response: Her Majesty was not content with the sending of the elephant. Fearing the loss of his only major ally, Henry abandoned his Huguenot faith and converted to Catholicism, famously declaring that France is worth a mass. With religion no longer dividing him from his subjects, the French people immediately rallied behind him. Empowered by his newfound support, Henry broke his earlier agreement with England and the Netherlands, in which all three nations had pledged not to pursue peace with Spain independently. Although Elizabeth was now free to withdraw her forces from France, she had lost a crucial ally in her long struggle against Philip of Spain. Around this time, Robert, Earl of Essex, began to reveal himself as an increasingly intolerable presence at court. Since his appointment to the Queen's Privy Council in 1593, Elizabeth's favorite had become a constant source of friction, particularly with William Cecil, her long-serving Secretary of State. A familiar pattern soon emerged. Essex would push for something that went against the Queen's wishes, pester her until she grew exasperated, stormed off in a huff, and then wait to be forgiven. During one such conflict, this time over the appointment of his ally, Francis Bacon, Essex uncovered yet another plot against Elizabeth's life. He used this information to worm his way even further into the Queen's inner circle, strengthening his influence within her security network and keeping himself close to the center of power. Despite his failures in Portugal, Essex was granted yet another military command in 1596, this time tasked with safeguarding the former English stronghold of Calais in France. However, he and his forces arrived too late to stop the Spanish from capturing the city. Not wanting to waste the assembled troops, Essex redirected the expedition to Spain, where he successfully launched an attack that destroyed two of Philip's largest warships and sacked the port city of Cadiz. The Queen, however, was furious, both that her orders regarding the mission's target had been ignored and that Essex had taken it upon himself to knight 68 men while abroad. Elizabeth was famously cautious when it came to handing out honors, and it was obvious to all at court that Essex was building a private network of loyal soldiers. Historian Anne Somerset explains Elizabeth herself was so sparing with knighthoods that in the first 25 years of her reign, the number of knights in England had actually halved. And this had been a deliberate policy. She understood that indiscriminately awarding such honors would only cheapen their value. To preserve the prestige of knighthood, Elizabeth had worked carefully to keep it exclusive. 400 years later, Elizabeth II didn't share the same concerns, handing off knighthoods to 13 actors, including Charlie Chaplin, Alfred Hitchcock, Sean Connery, and Patrick Stewart. Musicians Paul McCartney, Elton John, and Mick Jagger also received the honor. Like Elton John's first wife, the Earl of Essex misread the sexual tension between he and the Queen, who blocked him from publishing a written account of its glorious action in Cadiz. In order to once again regain his favor, the Earl volunteered to lead the military expedition to expel Spain's military, which had recently landed in Ireland in an attempt to establish a beachhead for an invasion in England. Ireland has long been England's Achilles heel. Unable to fully subdue the island, English leaders have historically feared that a foreign power might use it as a springboard for launching attacks on the British mainland. Strategically, it has often been seen as a soft underbelly of Great Britain. Rather than preparing for the arrival of the newly rebuilt Spanish Armada, the Earl of Essex diverted his fleet in pursuit of the New World treasure, hoping to capture large shipments of silver. But he failed on both counts. His ships weren't positioned effectively to intercept the Spanish fleet, and they came away empty-handed. England was left vulnerable until nature intervened. Massive storms in the Bay of Biscay battered the Spanish ships, forcing them to retreat and sparing England from a second invasion by sheer luck. Essex accepted no blame for the reckless risks he had taken with the island's security. Instead, he picked yet another fight with his fellow members of the Privy Council, this one so heated that the Queen, in a rare display of fury, struck him and shouted to her guards, "Get him gone and be hanged." She didn't mean it literally, of course. Their well-worn cycle of public quarrels, emotional exits, and eventual reconciliations had played out many times before. But this time was different. In the heat of the moment, the Earl of Essex instinctively reached for his sword, an unthinkable gesture in the presence of the monarch. No blood was drawn, but the damage was done. Essex, the man who now believed the Queen owed him an apology, had crossed an invisible line. To the court, it was clear. The Queen's favorite had begun to adopt a political posture that bordered on open rebellion. Essex once again volunteered to service in Ireland. This time, the enemy was not Spain, but an Irish chieftain named Hugh O'Neill, who had recently dealt the English a devastating blow at the Battle of Yellowford, killing 2,000 of their soldiers. Ironically, the English had intended to ambush O'Neill, but it was he that emerged from the confrontation more powerful than ever. As historian Anne Somerset explains, the Elizabethans regarded the native inhabitants of Ireland as loathsome savages. They condemned the Irish as primitive, bloodthirsty, ungodly, dishonest, filthy, promiscuous, and lazy. Even their appearance drew English scorn. They derided that Irish custom of wearing glibs, thick, curled tufts of hair that hung over the eyes. To the English, Glibs were not only a sign of savage brutishness and loathly filthiness, but it also fit masks for a thief. At this time, Ireland was effectively in a state of permanent lawlessness. The English controlled little more than a narrow stretch of land around Dublin, while the rest of the island remained outside their grasp. The Earl of Essex began his campaign with shocking brutality. He lured a local noble and his dependents to a banquet at Belfast Castle and had them murdered in cold blood. Hoping to draw the Irish into open battle, Essex found himself frustrated by their refusal to cooperate. Instead, they waged a highly effective guerrilla campaign, using the rugged terrain to their advantage and allowing malaria and dysentery to thin the English ranks. Determined to keep Essex's campaign from collapsing, Elizabeth committed to sending 2,000 fresh troops each month to replace his mounting losses. Ignoring the advice of seasoned veterans familiar with the challenges of English warfare, Essex pushed forward with a bold plan to strike at Ulster, now Northern Ireland, plunging deeper into hostile territory. At the last minute, the English noble abruptly changed course, redirecting his campaign to Southern Ireland. He spent the next 8 weeks chasing elusive targets, achieving little of strategic value. By the time he returned to Dublin, his army was reduced by 8,000 men, lost to disease, skirmishes, and exhaustion. His most notable accomplishment during this time appeared to be knighting yet another large group of his supporters, a move that once again infuriated the Queen. Elizabeth demanded that he march on Ulster without further delay. Instead, she soon learned that Essex had diverted his forces westward, resulting in yet another costly and fruitless delay. When he finally marched north, he did so with just 4,000 remaining troops, far fewer than the forces commanded by the chieftain, which shadowed the English army from across the river. Faced with this stark imbalance, Essex panicked. What followed were a series of actions that edged dangerously close to treason. First, he discreetly asked some of his noble allies whether an army of 2,000 or 3,000 men would be enough to rally England behind him if he were to return and to take control by force. Then, without the Queen's knowledge or approval, he entered into private negotiations with his Irish opponent, ultimately agreeing to an unauthorized ceasefire. Robert, the Earl of Essex, returned from Ireland with nothing meaningful to show for his efforts. He had now failed as a military commander in not one, but 3 separate campaigns. Fearing that others would shape the narrative of his failure before he could defend himself, Essex rushed straight to the Queen. And when I say straight, I mean it. He barged into her private chambers while she was still dressing for the day. Her wig wasn't even on yet. Such an intrusion could easily have been interpreted as an opening move of a coup, but Elizabeth, ever the shrewd stateswoman, kept her composure. She listened calmly to the agitated young noble, trying to gauge whether something more sinister was unfolding. Then, with characteristic poise, she encouraged him to change his clothes and join her for lunch so they could speak further. By the end of that conversation, she had concluded that her plaything wasn't plotting a rebellion. Yet, she still ordered him confined to his quarters. The reports that followed were deeply troubling. It was said that the only time Robert had drawn his sword during the entire Irish campaign was to knight someone. By this point, nearly half of England's knighthood owed their titles directly to him, fueling legitimate fears that he was building a private army loyal to himself rather than the crown. Worse still, the ceasefire he had negotiated turned out to be shockingly one-sided. Essex had told his Irish opponent that England would accept the Pope as the legitimate head of the church in Ireland, and that lands confiscated from the Irish rebels over the past 200 years should be returned to their original owners. It was a diplomatic surrender masquerading as peace. Assuming they couldn't prosecute the Queen's favorite, Elizabeth's council initially advised her to let Essex go, quietly sideline him, and ensure he never again influenced matters of importance. But this time, his mistakes were simply too grave to ignore. The Queen resolved that he had to be publicly punished. The Earl was brought to trial. She stripped him of his lucrative monopoly on sweet wine, triggering a financial crisis for the young noble. With creditors circling like vultures and his political career in ruins, Essex was placed under house arrest. There, he began quietly exploring potential alliances. He reached out to his sister's lover, who commanded a sizable force in Ireland, and to James VI of Scotland, who still harbored resentment over his mother's execution, and over the fact that Elizabeth had yet to formally name him her heir. James took the bait, replying with a series of letters voicing his support for rebellion in Essex's name. On Christmas Day, 1600, the Earl wrote back, declaring that the time had come for him to stop the malice, the wickedness, and madness of these men advising the Queen, and to relieve my poor country which groans under her burden. Unfortunately, Essex had lost his grip on reality by this point. Instead of carefully organizing a covert rebellion, he flung open the doors of his manor to anyone harboring resentment towards the Queen's rule. The ragtag assembly of discontents that answered the call ensured the plot was anything but secret. On February 7th, 1601, Essex was summoned to court to explain his recent behavior. He refused, claiming he was too sweaty from a game of tennis. The following day, the Queen sent 4 of her counselors to bring him by force, but Essex had them taken hostage and locked in his library. Then, with around 200 armed men wielding dueling swords, he stormed out of his residence. Yet no one rose to support him. Not when he claimed he was rallying troops to protect the Queen, nor when he changed course and declared he was leading an assault against her. Local militia quickly intercepted the would-be revolutionaries before they could escape the city. When shots were fired, the Earl's supporters scattered, and he abandoned the effort. Returning to his house, he discovered that the counselors he had locked in his library had escaped. With no options left, Essex surrendered to the authorities. Despite their once close relationship, Queen Elizabeth made a deliberate show of calm during the attempted coup, carrying on with her daily routine as if nothing unusual had occurred, unruffled and resolute to the end. Elizabeth was no stranger to signing death warrants. Over the course of her reign, she had authorized execution for traitors, enemy soldiers, Catholic priests, and even her own cousin, a fellow monarch. In nearly every case, she hesitated, delaying her signature as she wrestled with the consequences. But not this time. With the Earl of Essex, she signed the order without delay. Her guards, sensing the need for caution, withheld the warrant briefly to allow authorities time to extract more information about the broader conspiracy. King James of Scotland managed to escape implication, as Essex burned all correspondence between them before his arrest. The full extent of James's involvement would not come to light until Elizabeth's death. In the end, Robert was beheaded, and his uprising, known as Essex Rebellion, marked the final serious threat to Elizabeth's life. Over her 45-year reign, she had survived numerous assassination attempts from foreign enemies, former allies, and individuals driven by religious zeal to remove anyone but themselves from the English throne. Elizabeth famously said, "The past cannot be cured," and she consistently pushed forward, pushing her agenda despite every challenge. She faced down every danger to her rule, but Father Time remained undefeated. As you'll discover in our next episode, time itself would be the only force capable of ending Elizabeth I's reign. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or contacting EmpiresPod on Bluesky. If you'd like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.